So
Is that a different
Aaron,
version than the-
it is different than, let's say, the 1930s version, right? So, so last time, we had started to talk about, ever so slightly, the cultural wars that began in the 1930s. And so, the cultural wars that began then, in many ways have continued to this day. So, so if you taking that idea of cultural war, why do you think prohibition? Do you think they're okay?
I hope so. I think you came over there.
You? There's more than one person in there, they'll be fine.
Okay. It's a little scary. Okay. So, why do you think the prohibition is an example of the cultural wars? How is it this idea of division that develops? Rita, save us from ourselves.
I wasn't here, but Moriel sort of helped me, so I'll take a crack at it.
Okay.
So persons of like more Western European descent, like Germans, were more recent immigrants, were of working class and enjoyed drinking in like sort of saloons and stuff. And persons of early immigration were more likely to be Protestant and very much into like the temperance movement, but were also more represented by government. And when the war sort of started, and like public opinion sort of turned away from the Germans, like drinking became unpatriotic, and so prohibition sort of became symbolic of those cultural divisions between the two groups.
Okay, it's definitely a great start. So definitely that is why prohibition was first passed, was this anti-German sentiment. The fact that the Germans were the beer makers. Thank you. So the Germans are the beer makers. They represent kind of European traditions as opposed to American ones. Anything further as far as one part of the country versus another part of the country? Is there one area that was a little bit more in favor of prohibition and another area that is less? Yeah.
There was a stronger opposition in eastern cities.
Yeah. So there's a bigger opposition in the cities, and was that what you're going to say?
Yeah.
Okay. And what might be an attitude? Think of who would say, yes, I am in favor of prohibition, and who would not be. What might be someone who still, even in the middle of the 1920s, might say they are still in favor of prohibition, they think it's a good idea. What might be, trying to think from their point of view, what might be something, what might be their point of view as to why prohibition should remain? Okay, women were definitely part of it initially happening, and so that's absolutely true. But why would there still be an effort that would say, yes, we got to continue this thing? Rachel, you kind of had a hand up? Yeah.
Like corporate leaders, because like a lot of the people who did the drinking were the workers, and it like affected the quality of their work.
Yeah. Okay, so and many of the workers are what? The immigrants.
Immigrants, yeah.
Okay. And so are you starting to piece that together? Okay, the workers are the immigrants, and they need to stop drinking because it is wrong that they are drinking. Do you kind of get that? Can you kind of get that tone there?
Well,
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, since drinking was like a big part of a lot of the cultures,
Mhm.
by taking away the right to drink is taking away like one of their freedoms at home.
Yeah. So you're also and it's also kind of a way of just saying, no, if you want to be here, you meaning immigrant, this is what you're going to have to do. So very good eye. So can you see how can you see how this develops? Okay, why don't you hold this idea, and maybe after we talk about some of the other topics of the cultural wars, it will become a little bit more clear. So before we go on though, the way I built the lecture today, the kind of the little snippet on Hollywood didn't really fit as far as the story was concerned. So I want you to, it was in today's reading, but if you could go back to that, that part of the reading, part on Hollywood, and while you were doing it, look for this term, a flapper, okay? Look for what the effect of Hollywood has and by the way, think of this thing about immigration there's something about immigration and the effect of Hollywood. And then finally, the influence of a woman by the name of Clara Bow. Okay, so make sure that you kind of look at those 3 points, see if you could have answers for those 3 things. The homework for next time is to start reading about the Great Depression, and I put up online a kind of a worksheet. You don't need to have it done by next time, but for the time after. It basically, during the Depression, one of the things that happens is the government reacts with a whole bunch of different programs, a whole bunch of different things to be done. And there are so many of them that it doesn't make a lot of sense to basically have a lecture that just says, oh, and then they did this, and then they did this, and then they did this. So what I want you to do is kind of summarize what the big programs are on your own, and see if you can kind of come up with some themes as to what these programs are. And then I will kind of bring that together with the lecture, if that makes sense. Okay, so it's up at Schoology in the updates, the thing I want you to fill out. Got it? So we begin today with the second big event of the culture wars. And what triggers this event is that in public schools, they were teaching, particularly in biology class, something that conflicted with everyday values that many Americans kind of practiced at home. Okay, within their homes, they had a more traditional view of the creation of the universe and everything like that. And what the teaching of evolution did is that it had a tendency to undermine those traditional values. For some people, it was difficult to basically say that they could have a religious belief that did not coincide perfectly with a scientific one. And so, since there was a conflict, people felt that what was being taught was hurting their traditional values. So several states will make the teaching of evolution illegal. Okay. And this, by the way, when I was talking about the cultural wars, many of the conflicts are conflicts that still exist to this day. This is a conflict that still exists to this day. Anyway, one of the states that does this is the state of Tennessee. And so in Tennessee, there is going to be a biology teacher by the name of John T. Scopes. We sometimes call it the Scopes trial. John T. Scopes. And what John T. Scopes is going to do is he is basically going to purposely break the law. The law says that he cannot teach evolution in his classroom. He teaches evolution in his classroom. For this, he is indicted. You know, so when you indict someone, that means that you have officially accused them of a crime. So John T. Scopes is indicted, officially accused of violating Tennessee state law and teaching evolution in a classroom. Now when he does this, the American Civil Liberties Union is going to come to kind of his aid. And what they're going to do is they're going to help provide for him one of the best defense attorneys in the country. And basically what the ACLU saw this as is one of those things where you could get a case that if it gets out there, it gets into the appellate level, it goes through the court system, that in effect it might be able to challenge perhaps the constitutionality of this type of law. And so they were shopping for this type of case. They wanted a case that would basically get the attention so that maybe they could challenge this type of law that was coming into existence in state after state. And so, Clarence Darrow becomes the defense attorney. Well, this is a little town, and you got big guns coming in, right? Well, you need some big guns of your own. And so they get basically as an expert witness for the prosecution, 3-time Democratic candidate for the presidency, William Jennings Bryan. Obviously chosen star power here, right? He is a known. But why this trial? Well, you guys remember way back when I first introduced you William Jennings Bryan. I said that he gave this speech at the Democratic nominating convention, Cross of Gold speech, on Crown of Thorns, Cross of Gold. He was known for using religious imagery in his speeches. Religious teachings were part of the shaping of his beliefs. He was an evangelical Christian. And so they thought that he would have, basically, with his great ability to speak, okay, and his ability to use religious references, that he could be someone who could match wits with Clarence Darrow. Problem is, and there's two problems. A, match wits. William Jennings Bryan is not regarded to be the sharpest tool in the shed. B, religion. In effect, what William Jennings Bryan was being asked to do would basically be an expert witness, but on religion. And so what would you need, if you wanted an expert witness on religion, you would want someone who probably really knew religion, maybe a theologian, someone who studies and knows stuff. William Jennings Bryan uses biblical references, but he's not a theologian. And so what ends up happening is Clarence Darrow just constantly pushes him by bringing out obscure passages from the Bible and literally asking William Jennings Bryan to defend them as fact. Okay? And if you know much about the Bible, there's lots of really obscure stuff in there. And William Jennings Bryan can't do nothing. I use very euphemistic language here. I say that he's outmaneuvered in court. The reality is he is made to look the fool. Okay? And it was so devastating to William Jennings Bryan that 5 days after this trial, he has a stroke. In the end, however, whatever Clarence Darrow did in court, he could not undo what John T. Scopes had done. Scopes had violated Tennessee state law by teaching evolution in a classroom. And so whatever the dramatics of the court case, which were probably more about what was going to happen later at the appellate level as opposed to that particular case, Scopes is found guilty. He is fined $100. That was for violating this law. Later, by the way, this verdict does get overturned on a technicality on how the case was presented as opposed to the merits of the case. But the basic idea is that it was still illegal to teach evolution in Tennessee. Now the case was called the monkey trial, okay? And there's two real levels for this. If you, first of all, think of the monkey trial, what was the case about? Evolution, haha, get it. Two, it was a carnival. Basically, this case, it was one of your first, you know those big cases that you can't shut off, you can't turn on the TV and not see every detail, every channel is covering it? Okay, well, this was one of those cases. Okay, all the newspapers across the country were covering the Scopes trial because it truly displayed this division that was developing in America. Where outside the courthouse you had people put three-piece suits on monkeys and walk them up and down the street. It was this giant, you know, everybody was picking a side here. Cultural division. As far as the law was concerned, this law does not get repealed until 1967 in Tennessee. But even though this law is repealed in 1967 in Tennessee, doesn't mean that the issue went away. Right here in California, about 10 years ago, in Vista, there was a school board that basically tried to outlaw the teaching of evolution. More recently than that, there's been this idea of co-teaching both evolution and intelligent design, a kind of a scientific version of creationism in classroom. This cultural divide is still a cultural divide. And think about it. Are there, even if this one isn't something that, okay, well, I still think this is an old example, Mr. King. Are there more recent examples that are similar? Okay, yeah.
My sister told me that her English teacher was telling the class that the Big Bang Theory is wrong and that everything in the Bible is right.
Yeah, and so again, so it's still something that does enter conversations to this day. Okay. What? Good folks.
Were there any other states that outlawed evolution?
There were several states at that time. Tennessee was the one that we're focusing on because it was the site of the Scopes trial, but it did happen in several, particularly southern and agricultural-based states. Sodero, William Denny Bryan. If you like kind of court case dramas, there was a really good movie with the Scopes trial as its plot. I believe it's still fairly. I believe it's aged well. You know, some of the older movies didn't age well. I think this one kind of aged well. It's called Inherit the Wind. But it's a good one to kind of get a feeling. Yeah.
Is that the one where it was like a Rock of Ages?
No.
Or like I've seen it.
Okay. And so just one more thing about, quote, monkey trial. This would have been a political cartoon from the time period. And if you can't read it, the quote is, what would their verdict be? The third area where this cultural divide shows up is in immigration. And so what the United States is going to have is its next big era of nativism, which was a reaction to the immigration boom that had begun in the 1880s. Basically, many Americans had become very upset with the increase in immigration, particularly with where many of the immigrants were coming from. The main places that concerned people were that people were coming from principally Southern and Eastern Europe. And coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, this made it so you had people that spoke languages which weren't very much like English, okay? Slavic tongues, okay? Italian, Greek. People practiced religions that were not anything like the Protestant religions that were traditionally practiced in America. You had people that were Catholic, okay? People that were Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. You had people who practiced Judaism. And these were different than the traditional Protestantism of the United States at that time. Protestants believed that this immigration was in effect the root of the moral decline of America. The root of the moral decline of America, okay? Why do we have problems in America? Immigration. So in 1921, in Congress, they will pass what is known as the Emergency Quota Act. And what it did is, in the eyes of these people who thought that immigration is too much, that too many immigrants are coming in, is that it plugged the breach. You know, it's like a dam's holding back, you know, and if there's a breach of the dam, that means that water's flowing everywhere. Plugging it is trying to stop that up. What the Emergency Quota Act did is it set a quota for immigrants from particular countries, okay? And the way they did it was this. They used the census of 1910. And in the census of 1910, there was data that showed the ethnic origins, okay? So what you would do on your census form is you would say, what is your family ancestry, okay? And you would check a box, right? So, so they have the data that says where people are from. Anyway, so what they would do is they would take the number of people from a particular country, okay, that lived in the United States in 1910, and then set a quota of 3%, okay? So for example, I guess the best way to do this is by example. So let's pretend that in 1910, there were 100 Slovakians, okay, in the United States. With a quota of 3%, how many Slovakians would then be allowed in per year? 3. So you get how the quota works. You go by how many people are living here, and then take 3% of that, and that's your quota for any particular year. So the immigration year, which I think starts in July or something like that, from July to the next July, they would allow in only 3 Slovakians. Got it? The complaint with the Emergency Quota Act is that it still let in too many Eastern and Southern Europeans. The number of Eastern and Southern Europeans was close to 700,000 a year coming in under when there was no quota. Under the quota, there was still about, let's say, nearly 200,000 people coming in from these areas, and people still believed that was too many. Got it? So in 1924, they revisit this law. And in 1924, they passed what is known as the National Origins Act. What the National Origins Act does is it lowers the quota down now to 2%. But they're not done. They also will turn the clock back. They go back to 1880 as far as the census data that they use. Now, why did they turn the clock back to 1880 as their base year? Well, the beginning of that era of immigration was 1880. So if you go back to before all of those Southern and Eastern Europeans got here, right? Then there are fewer to begin with, and then take a quota off the fewer to begin with, and you get a super quota that is much, much less. Are you following me? So let's take my simple math example. So let's say back in 1880 there were only 50 Slovakians, okay, living in the United States instead of 100. And now take a quota of 2%. How many Slovakians are now allowed into the country? 1. So do you see how this worked? They wanted fewer people from these places that had these funny religions and funny languages, and people, particularly in the Mediterranean area, that look different, okay, darker. They wanted to keep those people out. However, Out here in California, they didn't think this law did anything for them. You see, out here in California, there wasn't a problem with Eastern and Southern Europeans. That wasn't the issue they were having here in California. And so, our Senator, Hiram Johnson, attempts to obstruct the passage of the National Origins Act until he can get something for the great state of California. And so, answering his demand, added to the National Origins Act is Japanese exclusion. Special demand right out here in California. Shut down Japanese immigration. Basically, what the National Origins Act and the Emergency Quota Act effectively did is they had changed American immigration policy. Before this, the United States had nearly open immigration. It was open except for obviously what group? What group was the United States not open to at that time? Chinese immigration. Okay? So, but the United States basically, before the 1921 Act and the National Origins Act, basically there were only three things that could prevent you from coming to the United States. A, you were from China. B, you were crazy. C, you were sick. Okay? But other than that, free immigration to the United States. Yeah?
Why were they so extreme with China, but not with the Japanese or?
Well, remember that the way that a lot of these things work is reaction. So the big immigration to, particularly back then, was California in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, because of the gold rush and working on the railroad, was China. Okay? So reacting to that, people in California demanded Chinese exclusion. Okay? So that remained on the books. But in this new era, the newer immigration problem in California was Japanese immigration. And so if it were today, California in the 1990s, because it's a little bit different than California today, but California in the 1990s or Arizona today, what would they perhaps demand in this type of law? What do you think the demand would be? What do you think California in the 1990s, Arizona today? Yeah. Okay. And so what people usually do is they're reacting to what they consider to be their current problem. So in the 1920s, for California, it was Japan.
Okay, but why didn't they just do the same thing they did with the Chinese? Why did they just completely exclude them?
Why did they completely exclude them? Because basically they could.
No, I mean, why didn't they exclude Japanese if they excluded?
Oh, when they did, because there wasn't, when they did China, Japan was still at that point a closed nation and wasn't really, people weren't coming from that at that point.
I know, but like, I don't get why they were so extreme with China, but not as extreme with Japanese in this.
Well, they are, because it's shutting down, it's Japanese, they're basically doing Japanese exclusion here.
Oh, okay.
So it's basically the same thing in the country.
Okay, because you just said that like only China could come.
Oh, before this law.
Oh, okay.
Okay, before this law, the only restriction on immigration was China. Okay, and sickness and crazy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But after this law,
Oh, okay.
it's a quota for the world, and no China, and no Japan.
Out of curiosity, like back then, what was their like idea of crazy? Like,
I don't know. I've read, when I was reading the, what the laws were, it did actually mention
mentally. Like,
mental and actual physically sick. Okay? So, my guess is documented. Anyway. Basically, we are now a place where illegal immigration exists. Before this era, with the big but exception of people from China, there was no such thing as illegal immigration. Now there is. Now, if you're, let's say you're on a, let's say there are 2 steamship ocean liners coming to Ellis Island in New York. Okay? And basically, what would happen between these 2 ships is they would, in effect, jockey for position to be the one that gets to the port first. Because it was very, very likely that some of the quotas were so low that one unloading of a ship could fill an entire quota for a year. And that second ship would just have to go home with everybody on board. So basically, just to kind of get what happened here. This was what actual immigration was per year, okay? Particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe. When they passed the when they passed the Quota Act, it went down to this amount. This amount was considered to be too much. So then, under the National Origin Act, it basically would only allow in this many people from Southern and Eastern Europe. So now look at that number compared to the people that were coming. Huge. Okay. We continued with quota policy through the 1920s and even into the 1950s. In the 1960s, we do switch up a little bit. In the 1960s, the Johnson administration is going to use family, keeping families together as a way of entry into the United States. Our final example of this cultural divide is the return of the KKK. Now, I could have reintroduced the Klan when we talked about the racial issues that we talked about last time. But I held it back for today because this new Klan is going to be a more special Klan. It's an equal opportunity hating Klan. Okay? In other words, it isn't just about African Americans in the South anymore. This new Klan is anti-foreign, anti-Catholic, anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-pacifist, anti-communist, anti-internationalist, anti-adultery, and anti-birth control. Okay? So, I dare say there's many people here at Palisades Charter High School that would pass this audition. Okay? Meaning, pardon me? Oh no, anti-birth control. Birth control. Okay? So, it's a, so in other words, yes, the Klan was big in the South. In most southern states, you could not get elected to be the sheriff without the Klan's backing. So it was really big in the South. But the biggest Klan membership in the United States, if you were looking for a particular state with the most people that were avowed Klan members, was not a southern state. It was Ohio. Okay? Ohio had the biggest Klan membership and still has major Klan issues to this day. Recently, they had a big fuss in Ohio when a Klan group tried to, you know how those adopt a highway things? Okay, they tried to adopt a segment of highway. Okay, so this segment of the highway brought to you by the blah 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 KKK. And so basically, what Ohio had to do is they had to, in effect, drop the Adopt a Highway program because they could not bar the KKK from adopting a highway under freedom of speech. Okay? Yeah.
So how did that happen? Like, did someone protest that the KKK was trying to do that, and then they just had to block the whole thing all throughout
Well,
Ohio?
first, the state tried to just stop them. When they applied to do the paperwork, they said no. And the Klan sued that they had the right to do it. And so the state decided to just end it. So if you're looking for who the KKK liked at that time, they favored Anglo-Saxon fundamentalist Christians. In other words, think about this division that was developing small town, city America. Where are you more likely to find a fundamentalist Christian small town? Where are you more likely to find anybody on this list? The city. Okay? So this was a huge, okay, cultural division. And then just in case you didn't notice, basically this Klan, not only is it nativist, but it would be against forces of diversity because that's different, and against modernity because that's changed.
What type of modernity? Like new buildings or what?
Ideas, for the most part.
So like anti-socialist?
Yes. And so, pacifist, internationalism, birth control. Modern. All right. Any questions on this? Does this make sense? So, does this remind you of anything? That slogan? Yeah, nativist. So remember back when we
Why does it say KKKK?
Yeah, that was because it was a particular
Oh, okay.
group
Like
with
Kentucky.
yeah.
Do they all have to start with K? Like the names?
I don't know.
You plan on making one?
But yeah, it was just a particular one. That's all. Anyway, think back to the election of 1856. Do you guys remember the Know Nothing Party? Also known as the American Party. And its slogan in the election of 1856, reacting to the German and Irish immigration of the era, was America is for Americans. It's back. Yeah.
Why the K for Klan?
I think the name first was because the first part of it was from a Greek word kuklos, became Ku Klux, and that was two Ks, and you know,
Had to add one more.
yeah, it's just a thing. Another point here, just to kind of keep hammering this home. This was a this is a parade in Washington D.C. Jay, notice anything about those Klan members in the parade?
They got their masks up.
Yeah, they're not hiding themselves. This is Klan and proud. Remember that in the election of 1924, Democratic Party had to fight back an insurgency by the Klan. The Klan was backing William McAdoo. to be the candidate for the presidency for the Democratic Party. And it took 102 ballots in the Democratic Convention to crush that Klan insurgency. That's how open the Klan was in 1924. They nearly got the Democratic nomination for the presidency. Okay. And then finally, just reminding us, former President Wilson. He was, his favorite film, the film he would show over and over again in the White House, was A Birth of the Nation, which was a loving portrait of the creation of the Klan. Yeah.
Now, was the kind of like exhibition of violence on such high levels like the original plan, or?
Yes.
It was?
Yeah. There you're probably going to get, if you're looking that on the more of the demonstration thing, maybe in the nativism, but obviously with African Americans, particularly in the South, but in places like Ohio as well, lynching. Lynching was huge. Yeah.
I have the 5 minutes, but we can pick up next and she can shoot with
All right. So what I want you to try and do, if you weren't here last time, hopefully you read enough that you know a little bit about the Red Scare. But what I want you to try and do is connect for me the Red Scare, the rise of the KKK, and the Immigration Acts. And what portrait do these three events paint about American society in the 1920s? Turn to your, I think we're all here. Turn to your White House and why don't you share what you came up with.
Yeah, he like on Saturday and was like, running I know, but I knew that he like would know that I had Should I do it now? Because he was with a friend who knows that I have it.
Even if they had it, they had it. If you thought that you never did
Okay, so, volunteered last time, so let's go with, Emily. What'd you think? Okay, awesome. Mom?
I said it as like, ideas of American culture started shifting really rapidly. People who are more nativists tried to resist, change by persecuting people who didn't fit their ideals.
Just.
It's like they feel more fearful of different animals, more and more animals with different ideas than their old traditions. Like that.
Yeah. Okay. Right, does anyone want to add? Yeah.
Can you give a quick overview of what the red squirrel is? So I'm scared.
Okay, so, after the war, there was kind of this combination thing where a whole bunch of workers are all going on strike, largely because people are coming home from the war and the factories are producing less. So you've got this atmosphere of workers, on strike. Remember, right around that same time, Russia had its revolution, which is supposedly a worker revolution. And so people start to fear, like this connection, that workers in all these different strikes are perhaps the beginning of that type of revolution here. At that same time, there has kind of this rash of mail bombs. And at first, public officials kind of downplayed any sort of connection between the two. But the Attorney General of the United States, a mail bomb will blow up in front of his house. And he just kind of goes nuts. And he basically starts targeting anyone with any sort of connection to the Socialist Party, the industrial workers of the world, anarchists, and arresting them. And if you were an immigrant, deporting you. And this basically went on for some time until he basically predicted there was going to be this big day of the bomb that didn't happen, which then the whole thing kind of petered out. But in its way, it basically allowed an easy kind of crushing of labor unions at the time, and it kind of fits in with the same theme of reaction against people with different ideas. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's now 1928. And Calvin Coolidge decides, he doesn't want to run for president again. Now, could he have run? Yeah. He had only served just over a year of Harding's term. Even under today's amendment to the Constitution, which says you can only run for 2 terms or be in office 10 years, he would have been qualified to run for another term. However, he decided not to. And my dad, who's a big fan of Calvin Coolidge, said that the reason why I didn't run was because he knew what was going to happen next, and he didn't want to be around to be holding the bag. My research shows, however, is that Calvin Coolidge had a son who, right before the election of 1924, when they were visiting the family farm in Vermont, stepped on a nail and cut his foot. Okay? One of those things that should have been the minorest of wounds. But it wasn't. He gets sick. We believe probably it was tetanus. Okay. And he dies. This devastates Calvin Coolidge. He nearly withdrew from the election of 1924. Throughout that next 4 years, this guy who was known for barely ever talking, talks even less. He gets the nickname Silent Cal. And so he just didn't have it in him to run for another term for president. Anyway, fortunately for the Republicans, they had a spare superhero. Okay? Yeah.
If he had run again,
Mhm.
do you think they would have voted him in?
Yes.
They would have, because, okay.
Yes. Because at that point, we are in a economic boom. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And we usually vote out presidents when the economy is rocking good times. Almost never happens. Anyway, the Republicans just so happen to have a spare superhero. The campaign was simple. Who? But Hoover. Okay? Who? But Hoover. Who? But Hoover. Now, why is this guy regarded to be a superhero? Well, during World War I, when Belgium was run over by the Germans, who fed the people of Belgium? Herbert Hoover. During the war, who basically fed the world as it was at war? Herbert Hoover. After the war, when Europe is in turmoil and we still are lacking planting of crops and things like that, who led the international effort to feed the people of Europe? Herbert Hoover. What have you done for me lately? Okay. In 1927, while Herbert Hoover is Secretary of Commerce, the Mississippi River decided it didn't like its current banks. Okay? And it moved. It's a meandering river. That's what they do. We've worked really hard to try and tell it that it wants to stay in a certain boundary. We've put up all sorts of levees and stuff like that to keep it contained. But every now and again, it gets grumpy and it moves. Okay? Well, when it moves, and it sort of moved just a few years ago, tried to fill up Nolens, okay? And after Hurricane Katrina, does anyone, this is a while ago, but does anyone have any kind of feeling for how the government responded after Hurricane Katrina in Nolens? Does anyone have a, yeah?
I thought it was very slow and poor. Like honestly, it could have progressed a lot faster.
Right. And that basically is the feeling, that the United States government did not really, it kind of dropped the ball. Okay, if that makes sense. Let's now go back to 1927. And Herbert Hoover is running the rescue whatever effort after the Great Mississippi Flood. Basically, his response was regarded to be amazing. And so this guy is popular. Everybody knows that whatever the problem, who? But Hoover. And so he is he was a rock star in his day. Democrats, well, they've cleaned up their act a little bit since 1924. There's not a KKK insurgent in 1928. And instead, they almost go the opposite. What Democrats do in 1928 is they are going to run an ethnic Irish Catholic by the name of Al Smith. Now, why does he get the nomination? Well, one of the things the Democratic Party oftentimes did was nominate whoever is governor of New York, because of this theory of the South, solid South plus New York nearly wins you the election. So he's governor of New York. He also was kind of the old school version of the Democratic Party. Working class, the bone and sinew. And he is a working class person who made good, who rose up through politics, okay? He's like us type of guy. Anyway, but here he is, this Irish Catholic city slicker boy. And in the era of prohibition, okay, and you know what, if you're in favor of prohibition, you were known as a dry. Well, he is very, 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 very wet. Okay? Got it? All right?
Was he drunk?
Openly against prohibition and drank publicly in the era of prohibition. Well, but who was in charge of enforcement? It was local. And what had happened by then is Mayor LaGuardia in New York had basically said, I'm not enforcing it anymore. So this is one of the reasons why Chicago became the place where he had all the shooting and gangster and everything like that, because it was still illegal in Chicago. New York, they basically said, we don't have the money to fight gangs and stuff like that, so we're just not going to enforce it. And basically the gang activity plummets in New York. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's why he'd be able to. Anyway, so here you have it, the superhero running on Republican prosperity and prohibition. And even if you were not practicing prohibition, you still thought it was a good thing that those workers weren't drinking. Okay? Against the city slicker wet guy. And Herbert Hoover will crush him. Okay? This is what you would call a landslide. He wins, Herbert Hoover wins all but 6 states. He even wins 5 states that had seceded from the Union. Now I know that it's been a while since we talked about the Civil War, but the Solid South was still a thing. And people were very reticent to vote Republican in the South. Except for when you have a candidate who is a Catholic, okay, who is in favor of still drinking in the era of prohibition, is obviously someone more of these modern values, as opposed to traditional American values. Okay. Solid South, but 1, 2, 3. Okay. Yeah.
Was it because he was like Irish and
Yes.
Catholic? Okay.
It is because he is Irish and Catholic.
So why did they think that that was a good idea?
I think it was just one of those power plays that happened every now and again from the North. Because remember that the North still had the most votes even at the convention. And so they were able to get the votes in his favor. Yeah?
If Hoover had held Louisiana during the Mississippi flood, then why didn't he win Louisiana?
So the Great Mississippi Flood is Mississippi River, so I don't know if it was all the way down in Mississippi.
All right.
So what are some of the things that were changing in this era that people were so reacting to? Well, one of the big changes, one of the big things that was kind of different in this era was that, particularly in northern cities, okay, cities like New York City and cities like Los Angeles. You have a question before I go on?
I know it's about the rise of modernism in art and music.
It is about the
Renaissance.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. So, and in this case, as far as modernism, art, and music, it was in the African American community. Okay? We call it the Harlem Renaissance. One of the big areas that it will take place will be in the Harlem area of New York City. Another big area that it took place was right here in Los Angeles, in central Los Angeles. There was a huge boom as far as art and music and whatnot, right here within our city. Anyway, in Harlem, what kind of led to this boom is during World War I. Remember that you had this kind of double thing that was kind of helpful to the African American community. One, people fighting in the war and being treated better, particularly overseas, as soldiers. Two, when people moved north in what we call the Great Migration and started working in American factories, the demand for labor, okay, led to more equitable treatment for African Americans in northern cities. And basically what this does is it's going to create kind of a racial pride, being kind of strong, wanting to express yourself much more than people had been in the South under segregation. We see examples of this in the art, in particular the poetry coming out of places like Harlem. Most notably would be a poet by the name of Langston Hughes. And let's turn it down one notch. Here's an example. And this is actually Langston Hughes. It's cool if we actually get to hear some of these people.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I too am America.
That was the call of my tuna man.
The other part of this Renaissance is the music. Some people would even call it the soundtrack of the 1920s and of the Harlem Renaissance. And that is jazz. Jazz as an art form is introduced largely coming up out of the South. We sometimes credit New Orleans with being the birthplace. But as it moved north, it gained, nuances and flavor from the various different cities that, as you moved up, particularly the Mississippi River. We basically say that jazz is borrowing from two other major kind of musical ideas. One is the blues, the other is ragtime. Okay, others as well, but these would be the major influences. If you're looking for someone to kind of hook onto as an exemplar, we're going to use Louis Armstrong. Okay? And we're going to listen to him. He's playing cornet. Before trumpets became really big, so it might have been a cornet. The most awesome instrument in this is got to be the trombone. That's the guitar. Also coming out of this movement are philosophies. And perhaps the biggest of these philosophies would be the one espoused by Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey founded the United Negro Improvement Association. And he championed an idea known as black separation. Now, it's kind of an interesting thing because you say black separation at the very same time that we had segregation. And what's really being argued here is that if African Americans continue to be part of American society as a whole and basically kind of took cues from white society as to whether or not there would be equity or not, then it just seemed like it was up to white society to almost bestow equity. Allow that equity to happen as if it were white society's choice as to whether there should be equity. Marcus Garvey believed that that just wasn't going to happen. And so he championed separating from white society because white society wasn't going to let this happen. He also would urge, okay, so where would this separation take place? Where would you go if you were to separate? He championed going to Africa. And this is where his philosophy gets muddled with business. You see, to make this happen, to have this movement go back to Africa, there needed to be like the transportation. And so he started urging his followers to invest in a steamship company known as the Black Star Line. And what will end up happening is the Black Star Lines will go bankrupt. And so, the United States government will prosecute Marcus Garvey because many of his solicitations for funds for the Black Star Lines have been done via the mail. The United States government will prosecute him for mail fraud, basically defrauding these investors. He will go to jail, but the President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, will commute his sentence in exchange for Marcus Garvey being deported to Jamaica. Marcus Garvey, however, has a legacy of African American activism. And you can find many of his ideas will reappear in the 1960s, most particularly in the philosophies of Malcolm X. Okay, some of the same ideas, and there's actually a semi-direct connection between the two. One of Marcus Garvey's bodyguards was Malcolm Little, who was Malcolm X's father. Okay, so there is a semi-direct connection. So Marcus Garvey is credited with helping create an attitude of activism, particularly among working class African Americans. And also because many of his views became more of a worldwide type of view, he is credited with helping start the Pan-Africanism movement, basically uniting all people of African descent worldwide. If the effect of World War I on African Americans was one that helped create this Renaissance, it's going to have a different effect on other people. Gertrude Stein will argue that what had happened in World War I, fighting in World War I, what had happened there had been so awful that it will basically cost us an entire generation of young men. She called this the lost generation. Now, if you think about it, so I'm kind of blowing this up to let's compare world wars. After World War I, President Wilson had said, "Hey, go change the world. We're going to fix everything. It's going to be awesome." And guess what? It wasn't. And so this entire idea, all the idealism ends up being lost. The lost generation. In World War II, the United States fares a little bit better at the end of the war. And coming out of that war, you do have people who feel they have changed the world. And so what do we call that generation? The people who fought in World War II. You don't know what that generation is called? No, the baby boomers are the ones are their progeny. Their babies are the baby boomers. Really? You know, the greatest generation. Have you ever heard that phrase? The greatest generation. So the World War II generation is usually called the greatest generation because they're the ones who go off and take on Hitler and win. Kind of cool. Anyway, huge difference between those two outcomes. One regarded a very powerful group of people after the war. The other, lost souls. Perhaps best articulated as far as being lost would be by Ernest Hemingway. Popov, okay? He wrote about the war. He had actually gone over to help as an ambulance driver. And he used his experiences as an ambulance driver to be kind of the basis for his novel, A Farewell to Arms. Now, basically what this novel is it basically telling you about how futile and how dehumanizing war is. If you're looking for that and they lived happily ever after story, spoiler alert, this is not that book. Okay? It's that book in which you think it's going to be okay, and it so is not. Okay? Another example of the literature of this era would be by Sinclair Lewis. And what Sinclair Lewis is going to talk about is how during the 1920s, we're going to have a generation where we're going to make lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of stuff. Okay? And it's materialism, we got stuff, everywhere stuff. But, okay, for some reason, no matter what stuff you bought, okay, it couldn't make you feel better. You still felt disillusioned. You still felt as if nothing has changed. Nothing has gotten better. So another downer book. If you're finding yourself in an exceedingly good mood and you feel you need a cure for it, okay, Babbitt, okay, good way to take yourself down. Final example is one that hopefully, well, actually I'm not going to say hopefully, I'm going to say probably most of you are fairly familiar with. How many of you are reading Gatsby? Yay, my timing is good. Okay. Okay. Depends on what tomorrow. Okay. Anyway, also a member of this lost generation, you have F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's going to write a scathing indictment or attack on American mindless pursuit of pleasure and material wealth. Okay. Okay, all those stories about Nick and Daisy and East and West Egg, okay? Yeah, great, Gatsby. Yeah?
Death of the Salesman?
Death of the Salesman is after the next war, after it's more of a 1950s thing. So F. Scott and Zelda. There's Zelda. Okay.
Extreme blood zone.
Nicholas. Yeah. No.
That's after World War.
That's also after World War.
Oh,
Salmon.
Salmon.
The second book is coming out this year.
Yeah. So now finally, okay, I've alluded to it several times, particularly in the elections, that during the 1920s, we had a rockingly good economy, okay? The economy, right after the war, the United States had gone into a recession. And it proved to be temporary, powerful but temporary. And it almost makes sense as to why it happened. You've got, you're no longer creating all the war stuff, so you got to change your factories from war stuff making. Okay, you have, you've gone from a labor shortage to a labor glut, and that so that created a recession. Add to that all the strikes and things like that led to the Red Scare. Okay, so it's messy, 1920 through 1921. But in 1922, the recovery began. And this recovery will turn to a boom, where we will have almost 7 years where you will have consecutive quarters, every quarter, of growth. It is the second longest sustained period of growth in American history. The 1990s, under this guy named Bill Clinton. During this time, incomes will raise about 24%. And so, what do you think the fuel for this boom is? The great, yeah. Well, it is going to be credit, okay, but it's buying stuff, okay, and you're absolutely right that credit fuels the buying stuff, okay. During this era, we also see that shift that had begun under after the Civil War. That thing that Woodrow Wilson was terrified of. Woodrow Wilson was terrified that corporations were going to take over and we wouldn't have any sort of Main Street America anymore. Well, it has become Wilson's nightmare. The most growth, the biggest growth in America will happen at the corporate level. We'll end up with more and more corporations and fewer small businesses. So much power will fall into the hands of these corporations that basically, if you didn't count, the wealth that's basically in the banks, okay, bank wealth, and you just went with growth wealth of the period, 200 corporations in America controlled half of all of the wealth in America. 200 corporations in America controlled half of all the wealth. Yeah? However, even though we are seeing big growth in factories, big growth in chemical factories, big growth in manufacturing, the growth obscured something. You see, after World War I, agricultural America, still nearly half, not half anymore, but nearly half the population of America are farmers. And on the American farm, we had a depression that lasted the entire 1920s. So I want you to all think about this. We're going to talk about a crash next time. The crash of our economy. But when that crash takes place, the American farmers are basically going to say, what took you all so long? Because they were already in a depression. At this time, the economy was driven by consumer spending. So what was driving this economy, what was making it stronger, what was making it boom? Consumer spending the money. But at one point, the basic products that we all need, okay, the stuff which you normally know you need, you had that. However, corporations still want to sell you stuff. So what corporations are going to have to do during the 1920s is start to convince you to buy stuff that you didn't even know you needed. And how did they convince you to buy stuff that you didn't even know you needed? Advertising. So in the 1920s, we see the birth of the modern advertising industry. If you think of banking in America, you think of Wall Street in New York. If you think of advertising in America, you think of a place called Madison Avenue. Madison Avenue. And then finally, as Muriel, yeah?
Isn't that like, promotion a lot of times when advertising more so be associated with Times Square, and from Madison Avenue it's more so just consumerism and the fact that there's a ton of retail stores and stuff.
I think we still, when we talk about advertising industry, we still think Madison Avenue. Times Square is like where you see the ads, but where you see the industry, where the companies were, it was Madison Avenue. If that makes sense. Finally, if you're going to get the consumer to keep spending and buying stuff that they didn't even know they needed, how are they going to afford to keep buying that stuff? And that is with credit. And so what will happen is that during the 1920s, you're all of a sudden going to get this thing where people are going to be looking and saying, well, gee, I can't afford to buy this right now. But wait, I'm going to make money in the future. And you're going to go, hey, future me, I'd like to buy a car. It's cool. Awesome. All right, future me, I love you. Okay, so future me buys you a car. And you go, oh, I need a bigger house. Future me, how am I doing? I can buy a house too? Awesome. Love you, future me. Okay. House 2. Oh. That new car is fancier than mine. Future me, can I replace this car and get the fancier one? Because it's like yellow. Awesome. Love you, future me. Keep spending? You got it. And basically what will happen is people start, in effect, mortgaging their present, feeling that the future could pay for it. The best example of this growth happened in the car industry. In the car industry, they start to make a discovery that, everyday workers, they can't really afford our stuff if we just continue to market it for the really rich. And so what Henry Ford will do is he will use his assembly lines, and he will start making cars for the rest of us. Cars that the everyday worker could afford if they just take a little chunk out of their paycheck, okay, and finance it. He starts increasing productivity. He will be able to produce a new car every 10 seconds. And he tell you, hey, you can get that car in any color you want, as long as it was white. Because they all look the same, because they were all cheaper that way. And therefore they're affordable. In 1929, there will be 29 million cars in America, one for every 4.9 Americans. That is more than all the rest of the world combined. Okay? More cars in America than all the rest of the world combined. The car industry will then displace steel as the kingpin of the economy. Because with cars, well, basically you're going to stimulate all the other major industries. You need the steel for the car, you need oil to fuel the car, you need glass for the car, you need rubber for the car. Basically, almost every industry, okay, is going to be touched by the increased demand for cars in America. King Cotton, King Car. King Car and then King Car. cut. Yeah, I know, it just gets all confusing after a while. I should have blown up the picture. Basically what this is basically showing the weekly purchase plan, so you can buy your car on credit. This is, does anyone remember where we parked the car?
How do they remember?
It was a problem, and back then, you didn't have the keys that were different and stuff like that. Even all the way through the 1960s, my dad once, he had a Ford Mustang, and he pulled into a parking lot to go to a meeting. And while he was in the meeting, another Ford Mustang pulled in next to his. Came out of the meeting, and that car was the first car he saw. His key opened up the door, started that engine, and he drove 3 blocks before he realized that he was in somebody else's car.
Wait, question.
Yeah.
But they have the technology to make keys for different doors.
Now they do, but
For houses and stuff, they have the technology.
they had the technology, they just didn't.
They didn't think it was necessary, or?
Yeah, it just wasn't a thing yet. Okay. When next we meet, we are going to talk about the stock market and how it was so very, very awesome and then not.
Oh, yeah, for sure.